The year is 1216. The wind howls through the marshes of Norfolk. A king lies dying in the dim torchlight of Newark Castle, clutching his belly, whispering names only he remembers. His gold is gone, swallowed by the tide. His crown is a curse, and no soul waits beside his bed. They call him tyrant, coward, betrayer. But once, he was a prince. Tonight, you will walk the long corridors of his rise and fall. This is the story of the King No One Mourned. Before you drift off completely, whisper your thoughts below. Was King Henry III forgotten, or simply misunderstood? Do gentle rulers leave lasting echoes, or are they lost to louder names? I read every quiet voice left behind, and your comment helps this story live on. Type still remembered if you made it to the end. Sleep well, traveller. In the cold corridors of Windsor Castle, where the light falls in stripes through high-set stone windows, a boy walks alone. He's small for his age, 8 years old, perhaps. His robe is slightly too long, brushing the rush-covered floor. His hands are folded neatly behind his back. He does not speak. His name is John, and though he is a prince, the son of a king, there is no feast for him. No tutors wait for him in the courtyard. No knights teach him the sword today, for John is the youngest and the least loved. His father, King Henry II, rules over more land than any English monarch before him, from the borders of Scotland down through the wild moors of Wales, across the Channel into Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and beyond. A true empire, but empires are built on bloodlines, and John is the fifth son. There is Henry the young king, crowned, while his father still breathes. He is the shining heir. There is Richard, strong, golden, already spoken of in songs. Geoffrey, clever and ruthless, Duke of Brittany by marriage. William, already dead, but still spoken of with more warmth than John. And then, there is John Lackland. The name is not affection. It is a wound. Lackland, his father once laughed, for he shall inherit no kingdom. But John watches. He listens. He learns the games his brothers play, their arguments, their arrogance. He watches how they court the favor of the barons, how they boast of battles they've never fought. He knows he is smaller. He knows he is forgotten, but he also knows something they do not. He sees his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, once Queen of France, now Queen of England, brilliant and dangerous, watching from the gallery above. She sees John, too, and while the older sons fight wars, rebel, even raise swords against their own father, John stays behind, still, patient. One winter, John sits near the library hearth. His hands rest on a velvet-bound book, a treatise on Roman kings. He cannot read every word, not yet. But he studies the portraits, the borders, the names carved in gold. One day, he thinks, they will write of me, too. Even if they don't love me, even if they forget me. He's not yet cruel, he's not yet feared. But deep in the child's chest, behind the small folded hands, beneath the silence, something coils, a need to be seen, to be remembered, to wear the crown not by birth, but by force. In the towers above, Richard sharpens a sword. In the chapel, Henry the young king prays for glory. In Aquitaine, Geoffrey sends letters to stir rebellion. And in the dim corridor, young John walks unnoticed, his steps light as ash. He will wait, he will learn, and one day, when all the others are gone, he will be king. Time passes like smoke in the corridors of power. And as young John watches, the empire around him fractures from within. The sons of Henry II are no longer boys, they are men, each with a claim, each with an army, and each one dreaming of a crown not yet theirs. They do not wait for the old king to die. They begin to move against him, slowly, then suddenly, like wolves circling a limping stag. It begins with Henry the young king, the crowned prince, proud and foolish, grows tired of waiting. Though king in name, he holds no power. His father grants him titles, but not true authority, and so, the young king rebels, at first, in whispers, then, in flame. He rides to Paris, and there, under the golden banners of France, he makes war against his own father. John, still in his early teens, stays beside the old king, not from love, but from calculation. He watches as the family tears itself apart. Richard, the favoured warrior, Duke of Aquitaine, sides with his older brother. Geoffrey, sly and smiling, plays both sides. And Queen Eleanor, brilliant, bold, imprisoned by her husband for supporting the rebellion of her sons. A mother, turned conspirator. A queen, turned captive. John says nothing. He is the only son still loyal. If only for now. And for that, Henry II rewards him with castles, land, a taste of power. For the first time, John does not feel like the forgotten son. He feels useful, valuable, trusted. But his brothers do not forget. Not Richard, not Geoffrey, certainly not Henry the young king. And in the years that follow, war rises and falls like a tide across England and France. Father against son, brother against brother. Castles change hands, armies shift allegiance, cities burn, then rebuild, and in the middle of it all, John writes letters with a steady hand. He listens at doors. He remembers every betrayal. He begins to understand the true cost of kingship. But even those who rebel must someday face death. Geoffrey falls first, trampled in a tournament in Paris. Then, the young king, wasting away from dysentery, his golden hair damp with sweat, asking for forgiveness he will not receive. He dies with a crown in name only. Only Richard remains, strong, feared, and when the old lion, King Henry II, lies dying, betrayed and broken, it is Richard who kneels by the bed, not in love, but to take the crown. And John, he stands at a distance, hands folded, eyes cool. He watches as his father weeps, not from pain, but from the knowledge that his last days were spent hiding from his own children. When Henry dies, they find a letter among his possessions, a list of names. At the top, John, his favourite son, the only one who had stayed, and yet, in the end, he too had betrayed him. And so, the king dies, and the sons remain, only two now, Richard, the lion heart, and John, the watcher. One is destined for glory, the other for infamy. But in that moment, both wear the same blood on their hands. In the summer of 1189, the lion ascends. Richard I, son of Henry, brother of the fallen young king, now wears the crown of England. He's tall, towering, with golden hair and a sword already known in battle. The people cheer him as though Christ himself has returned. And yet, behind the cheers, behind the glittering coronation, someone watches. From the gallery, from the shadows, from behind a pillar in Westminster Hall. His name is John. He smiles faintly, the smile of a man who knows how quickly crowns slip. Richard is king now, yes, but kings must leave. And Richard, warrior to his bones, has no taste for thrones or parchments. He hungers for Jerusalem, for the holy city, for the Third Crusade. He leaves soon after his coronation. Fleets of white-sailed ships bound for the heat and dust of Acre, Jaffa, and Ashkelon. And with him leaves most of England's gold. The treasury is emptied to fund the crusade. Richard even sells royal offices to the highest bidders. I would sell London itself, he laughs, if I could find a beer. In his absence, he names a justiciar to govern, a man of loyalty and law. But John is not content with silence. No longer Lackland, he now has castles, lands, power. And with Richard gone, he begins to stir the court like a stick through embers. He whispers to bishops, he dines with barons. He suggests that perhaps England needs a king who stays, a king who understands the island, not the desert, a king not halfway across the world, chasing relics and Saracens. And then, word reaches England. Richard has been captured. On his way home, somewhere in Austria, Richard is taken, held for ransom by Emperor Henry VI. The cost, 150,000 marks, a staggering fortune. England gasps. John smiles. He begins to seize castles that do not belong to him. He declares himself lord of the realm. He even swears fealty to King Philip of France, England's enemy. In exchange for continental support, he prepares not for rule, but for the crown itself. But power does not come easily. Eleanor of Aquitaine, his mother, still lives, fierce, clever, unyielding. She raises the ransom. She writes to every monastery, every noble, every merchant. Gold flows, one by one. The towers of John's rebellion begin to flicker and fail. And then, Richard returns. He does not speak much of John's betrayal. He does not need to. He takes back his castles. He strips John of favour. He lets the world know. His brother is no longer welcome in court. John retreats, small, ashamed, humiliated. But he does not disappear. He folds in on himself. Quiet again, listening, waiting. Because even lions grow old, and Richard will not rule forever. The lion returns, but even kings must bleed. Though Richard forgives in word, the court sees clearly. John has fallen from grace. No more feasts in his name. No titles whispered in the corridors. Only silence, and the sound of doors closing. John walks the edge of power. Not exiled, not honoured, simply endured. He spends his days in castles along the marches, hunting, writing letters, waiting. Richard now turns his gaze to France, to reclaim the lands lost in war. He raises new armies, builds new alliances, and leaves England again. This time, not on crusade, but to fight, to conquer, to restore the broken shards of his empire. And once again, John is left behind. But this time, he does not wait idly. He begins to write letters to lords, sheriffs, knights. He speaks not of rebellion, not yet, but of readiness, of service, of what he might do if fate were to call again. And fate, as always, listens. In the spring of 1199, while laying siege to a minor French castle, Cales-Chabrol, Richard takes a crossbow bolt to the shoulder. A minor wound, but the infection spreads, the fever rises, and within days, the lion heart is dying. He sends for his mother. Eleanor rides through the rain to be by his side. He names no heir aloud, but all know he once said, "Let my brother John have the kingdom." And so, on April 6, 1199, the lion dies. His body is buried in Fontevraud Abbey, his heart in Rouen, his entrails at Cales, and his crown passed to John. After years in the shadows, years of humiliation and watching, John stands beneath the great stone vaults of Westminster Abbey. The crown is placed upon his brow, and though the nobles kneel, they do so slowly, reluctantly. They do not cheer, not like they did for Richard, not like they did for the young king. But John does not need their cheers. He needs only their obedience. And now, at last, he has it. But even as he stands robed in gold, even as he signs his name with the words John, by the grace of God, King of England, he knows the crown weighs heavily. The barons distrust him. The church watches warily. And in France, in Brittany, there is another claim. One born not of shadows, but of blood. John wears the crown. He sits upon the throne once ruled by Richard and Henry before him. But the seat is cold. The realm is uneasy. Not all accept his kingship. Not all believe he was meant to rule. Because far across the sea, in the green valleys of Brittany, a boy watches the horizon. His name is Arthur, Arthur of Brittany, the son of Geoffrey, John's elder brother, long dead in a Paris tournament. But Geoffrey died a prince, and his son was born in blood more royal than John's. Arthur is only 12, but already the French king, Philip II, has taken interest. He invites Arthur to court. He dresses him in silk. He whispers ancient oaths into the boy's ear, and in 1202, he declares Arthur the rightful king of England. The barons of Brittany, Anjou, and Maine rise behind him. The house of Lusignan, powerful lords spurned by John, offer swords. A child becomes a banner. A rebellion begins. And John begins to tremble, but he does not show it. Instead, he rides, swift, cold-eyed. He moves through Normandy like shadow. And on a summer night in July, 1202, at Mirabeau Castle, John strikes. Arthur, now 15, is inside. He's surrounded. The siege is swift, and the boy is taken, alive, bound in silence. A prince with fire in his eyes, marched away under English banners. The rebellion shatters. The barons fall to their knees. But John is not done. Arthur is taken to Falaise Castle, a cold, damp place of stone and echo. He's held there, alone. No tutors, no letters, no light, just guards and whispers. Some say John came in the night, furious, drunk, raving. Others say a dagger was passed in silence to a hooded man. Some say Arthur escaped and drowned in the river. Others say his body was weighted with chains and thrown into the Seine. We do not know how he died. We only know he vanished. No funeral, no tomb, only silence and fear. After Arthur's disappearance, the nobles of France, once unsure, now turn on John in fury. They call him a murderer. They call him a coward king. Philip of France declares all of John's lands forfeit, and one by one, the provinces of the great Angevin Empire slip through his fingers like sand. They say the boy cried out, once, only once, not in fear, not in pain, but in rage. Arthur of Brittany, the boy in chains, was last seen beneath the walls of Falaise Castle, and after that, nothing. No one knows how he died. No monk records the date. No priest sings a final hymn. But across the realm, the silence begins to rot. The nobles whisper, the church recoils, and the French king, Philip II, moves swiftly. He declares John a felon, a king unworthy of land, of title, of trust. The castles of Anjou and Maine fall first, then to reign, then the great strongholds of Normandy itself, stone by stone, town by town, surrender. Some fight, most do not, because John has done the one thing no king must do. He has made himself feared, without being respected. In Rouen, an old knight, loyal since the days of Henry II, refuses to open the gates to John's messengers. In Le Mans, children throw stones at English soldiers as they flee, and in the abbeys, the scribes draw Arthur's name in the modgens, and beside it, a red mark, not a cross for death, but a blot for shame. By 1204, Normandy is gone, gone, the cradle of English kings, the land of William the Conqueror, lost, forever. John returns to England, not as a hero, but as a shadow. His baggage train is lighter, his letters go unanswered. The court avoids his gaze. He tries to explain. The loss was strategic, he says, or unavoidable. But even the stone faces of Westminster do not believe him. In the dead of night, John walks alone through his private gallery. He passes the portraits of kings before him, William, Henry, Richard. He lingers before his father's face, the one man who once believed in him. And then, he keeps walking. The boy in chains is never found, but John carries him, not in body, but in shadow, in dreams, in the eyes of every baron who kneels with clenched fists, in the voice of every clerk who reads his orders and hesitates. Arthur is not gone, not truly. The candle guttered again, its tall shadow flickering against the damp walls of Winchester. The flame leaned sideways, dragged by a whisper of cold wind that had slipped through the narrow window above the stone corridor. John sat motionless beneath a tapestry. The threads faded from salt and time. His crown, heavier than it looked, rested on the oak table beside him, surrounded by empty goblets and unopened scrolls. He had not touched them in hours. His fingers curled loosely around a small ring, Geoffrey's ring. His dead brother's seal was worn smooth at the edges, the lion's face half faded. John turned it in slow, hypnotic circles, again and again. Across the sea, he thought, they are closing the gates. Outside, a church bell tolled once, not loud, not solemn, just a weary thump of bronze through the night. John did not move. A scroll lay unopened near his hand. He knew what it said. He didn't need to read it. It had arrived that morning, carried by a silent courier who did not bow. He had set it down with shaking fingers, then left the room backwards, without waiting for the king's reply. The seal on the scroll was blue and white, Philip's colours. The king of France had taken Rouen. John closed his eyes. Rouen, the ancient capital of Normandy, the cradle of his dynasty, the fortress that had once welcomed William the Conqueror, that had sung at the coronation of his great-great-grandfather. Gone, not in battle, not with fire and glory and the songs of dying knights. No, they had simply opened the gates. No siege engines, no last stand. The city, aweary, distrustful, and quietly ashamed, had chosen to surrender, without a fight, without him. Somewhere above, in the belfry, a raven struck the sill and fluttered away into the rain. It left no sound, only the wind remained. John opened his eyes. The fire had burned low. He leaned forward, whispering only to the shadows of the hall. Normandy. He let the word hang there, as if saying it might bind it to him again. But it did not. The name drifted like ash. He stood slowly, as though the act itself was treason. The chill slid through his joints. His knees ached. His boots scraped against the stone. He walked alone. No guards, no scribes, no lords. Just the sound of dripping water and his own breath. Each step toward the war room echoed like a clock, tolling the hour of his ruin. Inside, the chamber smelled of wet wool and wax. Maps lay across a long table, thin lines drawn in charcoal, each one once carved with ambition. England, Wales, Ireland, and across the Channel, the once mighty tapestry of the Angevin Empire, Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Normandy, now faded, smudged, gone. He reached for a figurine, a small lion carved in ivory, meant to represent one of his garrisons. He set it down slowly, then swept his hand across the map. Figures tumbled, knights fell without sound. He pressed both palms against the table and whispered, "They never saw me as king. Not truly." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from memory. They had followed Richard. Even in death, they followed him. He was a story, a song. John was a name in ink, a burden, a weight. The doors opened quietly behind him. A cloaked figure stepped inside, bowing low. His chancellor, William de Grey. He said nothing. He waited. John did not turn. Finally, he whispered, "They surrendered Rouen." William nodded slowly. "Yes, sire." "Did they even fight?" "No, sire." The gates were opened by the bishop himself. The town did not resist, and the barons, most, have already sworn fealty to Philip. The rest are fleeing. John's shoulders sagged. A quiet cough escaped his throat. Not sickness, just bitterness. He turned then, slowly, facing the man. "Why, William? Why do they leave me so easily?" The chancellor was silent. Then, choosing his words carefully, he whispered, "Because, your grace, they fear you more than they respect you." John did not answer. The rain outside picked up slightly. The shutters rattled. "Send word to the sheriffs," John said, turning back to the map. "Raise the scutage again. We need coin, and more ships." William hesitated, then bowed once, and vanished into the corridor. John stood there long after he was gone. He traced the map with his fingertip. From Dover to Rouen, from Rouen to Chinon. The ink was still there, but the land was gone. Normandy is gone, but England still breathes, and now that breath grows shallow. The morning came like a ghost, grey and hollow. The sky offered no sunrise, only a dull smear of pewter light behind the clouds. The flags above Dover Castle hung limp. The sea below was quiet, but not still. John stood in the east tower, arms folded behind his back, his eyes fixed on the distant shimmer of the French coastline. He said nothing. He had stood there an hour already. Behind him, his steward paced nervously, holding a small leather-bound ledger. "Your Grace," he murmured, "the scutage rolls are incomplete. Some barons have not responded." John didn't move. "Some," the steward added, "have not paid in years. They claim their lands are exempt." Still, John said nothing. Then, so softly the steward almost missed it, "Then strip them of those lands." The steward blinked. "Your Grace, if they do not pay, they do not serve," John whispered. "And if they do not serve, they do not deserve to hold the king's land." He turned. "We'll make examples of a dozen, perhaps 20. His voice was calm, too calm. Over the next weeks, John's fury was not loud, but it was thorough. Sheriffs were dispatched with royal writs, riding across England to the manors of those who had grown to quiet in their loyalty. Lands were seized, castles were occupied, wives were held hostage, heirs were denied titles. and those who complained simply vanished from court. In Winchester, a gathering of lords met quietly after dusk in the chapel cloister. No one raised voices, no torches were lit, only whispers and the rustle of wet wool. They spoke of Normandy, of the taxes, of the arrogance. He threatens like a lion, one muttered, but he bleeds like a sheep. We sign no oath to serve a murderer, another added. We will not be extorted for wars he cannot win. They did not speak of rebellion, not yet, but the silence between their words was wide enough to hold it. John knew. Of course he knew. His spies reported everything, and the more he heard, the more he recoiled inward. He stopped hosting feasts. He stopped walking the great halls. He began holding meetings at midnight, surrounded by guards, lit only by candles, his robes heavy with fur, even in the spring. He was no longer king of England. He was king of shadows. Normandy had been the outer wound, but the infection was spreading now, inward, toward the heart of the realm. One morning, a priest from Canterbury approached the royal gates, carrying a sealed message from the archbishop. He asked for audience. John refused. Another letter came, a plea for clemency regarding a lord imprisoned without trial. John burned it. A third letter arrived, this one from Rome, but it was left unopened on the floor beside his bed. John wrote long letters through the night. Most of them never sent. Some were drafts of proclamations. Others were filled with long passages, copied from Roman law, as if the authority of Caesar might protect him now. But some were stranger, scrawled, unfinished, and written not to subjects, but to ghosts. You were not better than me, one said. Never signed. They only loved your sword. Another read. They never feared your silence. Father, I am what you made me. By early May, the first nobles began refusing to attend court. One simply did not arrive. Another sent a proxy. A third, the Earl of Essex, claimed illness, but was seen hawking in the hills that same afternoon. John responded with new levies, more taxes, another round of scutage, and slowly, one letter became 2, 2 became 5, then 10. The barons were beginning to write to each other, not to him. At Westminster, the corridors grew quieter, the halls echoed longer. Even the tapestries, thick with dust and sea salt, seemed heavier. And in the center of it all, a king who ruled by paper and pressure, not presence. A king who had lost the land of his ancestors. A king who now turned inward, pulling the walls tighter around himself. One tax, one decree, one betrayal at a time. It was not just the nobles who felt the shift. Even in the villages, far from court and castle, the air had changed. The people no longer prayed for the king by name. In country chapels, the scribes wrote his titles, smaller on holy days. In marketplaces, coins bearing his face were flipped over before being passed. Superstition, perhaps, or survival. In a stone chapel near Canterbury, an old monk sealed a letter in beeswax. It was not addressed to the king, but to Rome, to the Pope himself. It spoke of silence from Westminster, of unjust arrests, of barons who could no longer trust the crown, and of a growing fear that the king no longer heard the voice of God. In cathedral vaults, high above the altar, the Archbishop of Canterbury paced beneath ancient ribs of stone. He had once offered counsel to the king, mildly, patiently. He had once sent gifts, a gold-bound psalter, a relic of St. Edmund. Now he sent warnings. They went unanswered. The last messenger was returned without shoes. In Rome, word began to travel of a king who taxed the altar, who sold the bishoprics to pay for soldiers, who took hostages and ignored prayers, who made war with the cross itself. Pope Innocent III, the most powerful pontiff in 100 years, wrote once, twice, then thrice. Still, John did not respond. And so, the Pope responded in his own tongue. Silence. On March 23, 1208, Pope Innocent issued a decree from the Lateran Palace. He placed England under interdict, a punishment of the soul. In a single breath, the bells stopped. The sacraments ceased. The church doors were shut across the realm. No marriages, no confessions, no last rites, no funerals. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground, wrapped in wool, not laid to rest in holy earth. and the people began to murmur, "The king has cursed the land." John, upon hearing the decree, said nothing at first. He stood beside the hearth in the great hall of Winchester. The messenger knelt, head low. A single drop of sweat traced down his temple. The king stirred his wine with a bone-handled knife, then drank all of it, and said, "Let Rome fast and tremble. I shall eat well and sleep soundly." But in the months that followed, something shifted, not in the sky, nor in the stone, but in the eyes of his court. They no longer met his gaze so easily. They bowed, yes. They obeyed, yes. But behind every gesture was a question God himself had raised. If the Pope had turned from him, who then remained? In the countryside, midwives stopped blessing newborns. Woodcutters began carving small crosses into their doors. Even the sheriffs, all sworn to crown and coin, now began to hesitate before carrying out the king's orders. In Sussex, a priest was seized for refusing tax. The village rose in protest. John had 5 of them hanged, including a widow and her son. The church bells did not ring for them. There were no prayers at the scaffold, only silence. John began dreaming more strange dreams. He awoke in sweat, often shouting, sometimes weeping. Once, he whispered a name over and over. The servants would not repeat it, only that it was a boy's name. The interdict deepened, not just over the land, but over the throne. In a letter written to a noble in Anjou, the Pope referred to John not as Rex Angli, but simply as the temporal administrator of an orphaned island. Even the ink, it seemed, no longer called him king. And yet, John did not kneel. He did not write to Rome. He did not pray. Instead, he tightened the crown around his temples and made his plans in the dark. He sent men to seize church lands. He demanded coin from every parish that dared hold a chalice. He summoned abbots to court and imprisoned those who delayed. He declared the Pope a foreign enemy and called himself God's chosen prince on earth. The soul of England dimmed, and John reached for its purse instead. The year turned colder. Leaves curled brown along the river banks of the Thames. Smoke hung low over the thatched rooftops of the manors and the halls, and across the countryside, the king's men rode. They came with parchment, with names, with numbers. The new tax was scutage, again. This time, not to fund war, but to feed the king's debts, and bury his silence. In Yorkshire, 2 reeves were found dead after announcing the new levy. Their bodies lay by the road, stripped and burned. In Wiltshire, a churchman refused to surrender his chalice. He was beaten in front of his flock and left by the Ligged Gate. John heard of these things and demanded more collections. A king must not weep when the tree is shaken, he whispered. He must gather its fruit. The sheriffs obeyed, reluctantly, grimly, but they obeyed. They squeezed the towns for every silver penny, from noble and peasant, from widow and monk, from miller and merchant. At court, the royal clerks began to write in smaller script. The columns grew longer, the debts grew darker, and slowly the gold flowed in again. But with it came a silence, not of peace, but of dread. Lords stopped requesting audiences, priests shortened their blessings, merchants avoided the crown road, and the barons watched. Loyalty cannot be taxed, but John tried. He summoned the barons to Nottingham, not to fight, but to sign an oath, new and binding, an oath to obey, no matter the cost. Many came, most signed, but not all. The Earl of Norfolk sent a proxy. The Earl of Surrey sent nothing at all. Whispers began again, not among the servants, but among the heirs. Young men who had watched their fathers kneel in fear, oath whispered of iron and oath-breaking. Some began training in secret, some sent letters abroad, and some began to write to the French. In the castles of the marches, swords were sharpened after dark. In Kent, a long-forgotten fortress was repaired. In Oxford, a group of scholars, sons of nobles, held a feast to mock the king. Dressing as the shepherds of a blind sheep, John responded in kind. He rode with 20 knights to Northampton, seized 5 manors in a day, confiscated horses, took sons as hostages. He rode without banners, only the cold iron of his crest, the crowned lion, eyes gouged black by age. He called it loyalty, but they called it theft. and it would not last. By winter, the complaints reached Rome again, and this time they came not from priests, but from lords, names John had known since childhood: William Marshall, Roger Bigod, Robert Fitzwalter, Geoffrey de Mandeville, Hugh de Bourhon, names that once rode beside Richard, names that once served Henry II, names now questioning their oaths. John wrote letters to them all, not kind ones, not threatening either, but subtle, twisting, careful lines, written with poison politeness. Let no lord forget who crowns the kings of England. Let not old names lean on older memories. Loyalty is not born of land, but of submission. Some letters went unanswered, some were returned unopened, and in the far north, in a stone manor perched above the sea, an aged baron burned his king's letter before a fire and said only, "He's no lion, he's a man, cornered in his own den." When a kingdom loses faith in its king, it does not fall with a roar, it crumbles, like parchment left in the rain. The year was 1204, Normandy was gone, Rome had gone quiet, not in surrender, but in warning, and John, King of England, King of nothing, began to rule not by law, but by shadow. In the night halls of Windsor, barons walked with downcast eyes. They ate little, they drank quickly, they left before the fourth bell. For those who lingered, risked being summoned, and if you were summoned, you did not sleep well after. The king had taken a new habit. He called men to him alone, not with counsel, not in court, not with witness, just a single lord, and the king, and a question: "Are you with me?" There was no right answer. If you said yes, your estates were taxed. If you hesitated, your son might be taken as hostage. If you said no, you might vanish before morning. In the dungeons beneath Nottingham Castle, two nobles sat in separate cells. One had spoken ill of the king's scutage. The other had refused to send soldiers for a levy. They were never formally charged. No records were kept. Their names are known only because a monk wrote them in the margins of a psalter. Just once, in shaking ink, two lords, still breathing, not broken, yet, in Lincolnshire, a knight rode alone at night with a message sewn into his saddle, a name, a list, a gathering place. 3 barons met in a candlelit barn the next evening. One wore a red cloak. Another carried a carved lion's ring once given by Richard himself. The third, silent, watched the corners. They did not speak of war, not yet, but they each took a goblet and swore, quietly, that the king had gone too far. John heard rumors of the meeting. Of course he did. His spies were everywhere. He summoned the eldest baron of the 3, Robert Fitzwalter. The messenger who delivered the summons returned with a single word scratched into the wax seal: "When a king wages war against God, it is not the sky that speaks first, it is the silence below." Spring of 1205 came with ash-colored skies. The land was damp and joyless, and though the crops bloomed, and the lambs were born, no blessings were spoken over them. England remained under interdict. No confessions, no marriages, no mass, and John was unmoved. He summoned the bishops, not to seek peace, but to make demands. "The churches shall pay rent for the ground they stand on," he said. "If the Pope does not crown me in ink, then I shall rule by iron. Their silence is treason, their land is mine." 4 bishops fled to France. 2 others vanished into monasteries. The rest submitted, not in loyalty, but in fear. At Canterbury, the archbishopric stood vacant. The Pope had named a successor, a learned man, Stephen Langton. John refused to allow him entry into England. "I do not recognize Rome's right to choose my priests," Rome answered with fire. In 1209, Pope Innocent III excommunicated the King of England. It was no longer about sacraments. This time, it was personal. John, by papal decree, was cast out of the grace of God. No Christian was bound to obey him, no priest to serve him, no kingdom to recognize him as rightful king. A king could lose land, he could lose coin, but when he lost heaven, he stood truly alone. In the great hall of Winchester, John laughed, loudly, but only once. The laughter echoed strangely, like it didn't belong in the room. He drank deep from his goblet. "If Rome wishes to make war," he whispered, "then let her send armies. I fear no pope in armor." But his court had grown colder. Men no longer lingered. Letters arrived more slowly. Even his most loyal barons answered in shorter words. The merchants of Bristol began routing their ships through Normandy. Despite the war, wool exports declined, food prices rose, and still, no priests blessed the harvests, no monks rang the bells, no altars bore candles, even the cathedrals fell dim. England had not only lost Normandy, it had lost its name. On the lips of God, even a cruel king needs loyal men. But by now, John had none left, only names on parchment, only shadows at the table. In the west, where the wind runs cold through the Welsh hills, there lived one man still loyal in action, if not in heart. William Marshal, Knight of Honour, Earl of Pembroke, the last great lion of Henry II's court. He had once held John in his arms as a child, had ridden beside Richard, had served with quiet dignity under 3 kings, and now he watched England crack beneath the crown. John summoned him to court, not to honour him, but to accuse him. In the long hall, before a dwindling court, John stood with narrowed eyes. "They say," he whispered, "that you knew of Fitzwalter's meeting, that you dined with the Earl of Essex the night he refused my summons, that you speak fondly of the Pope's new bishop." Marshall did not bow. "I speak fondly of peace," he said. The room held its breath. "Do you deny," John hissed, "that you would prefer another king?" Marshall raised his head. His answer was silent. John dismissed him without ceremony. The man who had once stood beside kings now walked out of the hall with dust on his cloak. He would not return. In the days that followed, other names faded from the royal register. Some stopped answering writs. Some sold their English manors and fled to Normandy. Some simply disappeared. John sent his agents to seize lands, to pressure heirs, to place new men, loyalists, common-born, dependent. But they roared with fear, not respect. The nobles knew them as the king's dogs, and their presence only widened the gap. In a manor outside Salisbury, 5 lords met under cover of a hunting trip. Each had once sworn full loyalty. Each had held titles granted by royal hands. Now, they whispered another name. Louis, the son of the French king. He has Plantagenet blood. He's married to Blanche, John's own niece. They did not speak of rebellion. Not yet. But they did not speak of John either. In York, the bishop's scribes stopped writing Rex before John's name in church records. In Oxford, a scholar was imprisoned for publicly reading a poem that mocked the crown. In Winchester, knights were flogged for speaking of Arthur of Brittany aloud in the guard hall. Even the wind seemed to shift, no longer against foreign threats, but turning back toward the throne. Normandy had fallen. The church had turned away. The barons grew distant, and now the king's last allies were walking backward, bowing with cold eyes, and not returning his letters. Kings do not always fall in battle. Sometimes they drown in the weight they carry. Autumn, 1212. Heavy rains blanketed the coast. Marshes swallowed roads, and the rivers swelled fat with mud and old secrets. John had planned to cross into Wales, to crush a rising whisper of rebellion there. He packed heavily. Too heavily. Wagons rolled south toward the Wash, a tidal inlet along the east coast. Dozens of carts, hundreds of horses, chests of gold, royal regalia, scrolls, charters, seals, everything the king held dear, except loyalty. He rode behind them, high on a black horse, under a crimson banner, now rain-drenched and torn. His guard kept their eyes forward. None spoke. The rain did all the speaking now. As the wagons neared the crossing, the tide was out. Shallow pools glimmered across the flat saltpan. The drivers pressed on, but the tide turns quickly in the Wash. It is not a sea that forgives hesitation. It is not a land that forgets arrogance. The water came fast, faster than any could run, faster than John could command. The lead wagons were swallowed. Horses reared and vanished beneath the tide. Chests split open, scrolls scattered. The king's great seal, lost. Dozens of men drowned. Everything else sank beneath the grey water. Normandy was a land. This was a symbol. John watched from the shore, stone-faced, sodden. He did not speak for hours. When at last he turned his horse, it was said his crown slipped slightly on his head. Not enough to fall, but just enough to show it no longer fit. The news travelled fast, not just of the treasure, but of the omen. A king who could not keep his gold from the sea, could not keep the kingdom. In London, barons began meeting in open daylight. In York, a priest ended his homily with, "May the Lord preserve the realm, even if he does not preserve the king." And in Winchester, a whisper spread like frost across glass, "Perhaps it is time." By winter, the letters were flying across the channel, to France, to Prince Louis, to the Pope again, to each other, sealed in wax, hidden in psalters, tied under saddles, but all bearing the same message. The king has lost the land, the church, the treasure, and now, the hearts of his people. Let us raise our banners. Let us write a new oath. Let us remind him, a crown is not an anchor. It cannot hold when the tide turns. Normandy was the wound, but England became the scar. Winter 1212 faded into a dim, wet spring. The king's treasure lay somewhere beneath the tide. His crown sat heavy, colder each morning. His letters went unanswered. His men grew fewer, and the land around him changed. In cathedrals, the bells remained silent. No hymns, no incense, no coronation prayers. Even on Easter, the great halls echoed not with joy, but with empty platters, half-filled benches, and the king staring at nothing. At court, courtiers began whispering a new word, not treasonous, but bold. Magna Carta, a document, an idea, not to overthrow, but to contain, to put ink between the king and his power, to write down what he could and could not do. And John knew it. He tried charm, then threat, then gold, then blood. None of it worked. Even the coin turned cold in his hands. Even the laws he wrote no longer held weight. The nobles were writing laws now too, and their parchment would soon speak louder than his crown. John stood once more in the west tower of Winchester. The coast lay grey and soft beneath the mist. Somewhere out there, the bones of lost knights rested beneath foreign soil. Somewhere under the tide, a chest held the last seal of a king unloved. He touched the window ledge, cold stone, and whispered, only to himself, "They never mourned my brother, but they sang for him. No one shall sing for me, but they will remember." And so ends the chapter of Normandy. A land lost, a church turned away, a kingdom whispered into silence, and a king who ruled with shadow, but found none to stand with him at dusk. Not all storms arrive with thunder. Some gather in silence, and when the barons of England whispered, they whispered like men digging a grave. It began in Lincolnshire, beneath a crumbling arch once carved by Saxon hands. A private hall, a hearth, 3 cups of watered wine. They did not call it treason. They called it ... remembrance. Do you remember when a king asked counsel before he taxed? Do you remember when a priest was safe in his own abbey? Do you remember the Charter of Liberties Henry gave our fathers? The eldest among them held a leather-bound parchment, yellowed with time. It was the Charter of 1100, signed by Henry I. It promised protection of church rights. It swore that the king would not sell justice. It was the oath of a younger realm, and now they were ready to write it again. But bigger, stronger, not a letter from king to people, but a limit drawn around the crown itself. In the cathedral town of Bury St Edmunds, more arrived. Barons from Essex, knights from Yorkshire, even a man from the Welsh border, wrapped in furs and soaked from sea fog. They met not in a castle, but in the crypt of the abbey. Beneath the bones of saints, they took an oath. They would make the king agree. Not ask, not beg, make. It was not yet rebellion, but it was no longer loyalty either. The wind that left the cloister that night was colder than when they'd entered, and the message that spread through the realm travelled on hoof, parchment, and whisper. The barons are writing something. They're gathering. They speak not of the king, but of law. In a manor near Oxford, a steward passed a sealed letter to his lord with only 3 words. It has begun. The lord did not eat that night. He lit a candle and began sharpening his sword. The king had ruled through fear, but now fear moved past him and began to walk beside the barons. John had heard rumours before, vague talk of councils, of grievances, of letters to Rome, but this time something felt different. This was not the grumbling of winter-weary nobles. This was movement. At Nottingham, he summoned his sheriffs, "Bring me the names," he hissed, "the halls where they gather, the roads they ride, the ink they use." He doubled the patrols along the Roman roads. He ordered the ports in Dover and Horwich watched by trusted men. He even summoned the abbot of Bury Edmonds, demanding to know who had lit candles in the crypt that week. The abbot answered carefully, "Those who come to pray. Do not give their names, Majesty." John left the chamber without speaking, but his fist was bleeding from the nails pressed into his palm. He called for the Great Seal, the one he had replaced after the original sank beneath the tide, and from his dark chamber he sent letters, one to the Earl of Surrey, another to the Earl of Norfolk, a third to William Marshall, now living quietly in the West. Each letter was carefully worded. Each one ended with the same closing: "Let not memory be traded for momentary pride." None of them responded. A king could command soldiers, he could command scribes, but he could not command trust once it turned away. At court, he changed his tone. More honey, less venom. He dined with minor lords, spoke of unity, offered favors, but even the servants noticed there were fewer guests each week, and those who came left quickly. In the far north, barons began ordering blacksmiths to quietly prepare new chainmail. In the Midlands, stonemasons repaired old outposts that had not seen life since Henry's wars. In London, a merchant offered to supply carts, grain, and rope if certain lords needed to move southward come spring. John heard all of it, but each time the truth came too late. The meetings had already ended, the letters already flown, the alliances already sealed. In candlelight, in whispered oaths, in ink that bore no crown at the top of the page, the time for whispers was over. The barons had waited, had warned, had prayed. Now they would write. June 1213. 25 lords met in a hollowed-out priory in Northamptonshire. Some wore armor, some plain robes. All bore their fathers' swords, not for battle, but memory. On the table between them lay 4 sheets of calfskin, bound with black twine. The parchment bore no royal seal, only words. A charter, 41 clauses, written in steady Latin. Not a gift from the king, but a list of limits upon him. No tax without consent, no seizure of lands without trial, no imprisonment without cause. The church shall be free, and at the very end, if the king breaks this charter, 25 barons shall rise as guardians of the realm, and hold him to it by force. A copy was sent to the king. It arrived by horseback, wrapped in linen. No message, no title, just the charter. John read it in the west chamber of Winchester, beside a cold hearth. By now, the servants only entered when summoned. The fire was barely lit. He read in silence, clause by clause, one knuckle turning white as he gripped the seal of the crown. He did not tear the parchment. He did not shout. He only said, "So they believe themselves equal." The messenger bowed. "No, your grace. They believe themselves necessary." John sent no reply that day, but the barons did not wait. They chose a place, a field between Staines and Windsor, a flat meadow, by the edge of the river. Its name was old, Saxon, simple, Runnymede, and there, in the coming month, the king would be told, not asked, what his crown now meant. Not divine right, not absolute rule, but balance, written in ink, held by oath, and guarded by sword. The whispers had become breath, the breath had become word, and the word would soon become law. On the 15th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1215, the King of England arrived, not to command, but to kneel before parchment. The field was called Runnymede, a flat stretch of green between Staines and Windsor, where reeds bent in the breeze and mist hung low across the River Thames. There were no battlements, no banners waving, no trumpets, only quiet tension. And to camps. One held the king, the other, the barons. John arrived late. His cloak was wet, his hands gloved despite the heat, and beside him rode no brother, no son, only a handful of guards, none of whom met his eye. Behind him, Windsor Castle loomed, a fortress that had grown empty in recent days. Before him, across the meadow, stood a line of men with no crowns, no titles of majesty, but the weight of the realm at their backs. They carried no swords, only a scroll, and that was more dangerous. The barons did not bow. They did not sit until the king did. They offered no compliments, only the document, still 41 clauses, written in firm hand, now copied dozens of times, and ready for signature or war. John read each line aloud. Clause 12. No scutage or rage shall be imposed, without common counsel of the realm. Clause 39. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, save by lawful judgment of his equals. Clause 61. If the king fails in any of these matters, 25 barons may seize castles, lands, or possessions, until justice is restored. Each word was like a blade, sliding across a stone altar. The king looked up. The sky was grey. The barons were waiting. There were no cheers, no applause, only ink and silence. And the moment a monarch became mortal again, John took the quill and signed, not in joy, not in defeat, but in necessity. His reign had demanded obedience. Now he gave in to law. Across England, the news moved faster than the king, not by horse, but by breath and by hope. It was not called rebellion anymore. It was called restoration. Barons left Runnymede with something no subject had held in years, a signed promise. In Canterbury, monks whispered prayers over the first copy of the charter, read aloud beneath stained glass. In Lincoln, the mayor kissed the seal before setting it into the civic chest, and in York, a crowd gathered to listen as the town clerk read Clause 39 aloud. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay, right or justice. People did not cheer, but they stood straighter, and they remembered. For the first time in living memory, the king's word had a limit. The peasants still ploughed, the merchants still paid, the priests still preached, but the crown had changed. And yet, in the dim stone walls of Windsor Castle, John did not sleep. He held one copy of the charter in his hand, unfolded, creased, smudged with rain and wax. He read it again, and again, until the candle burned low, and still, he did not understand why it had come to this. I gave them land, he muttered. I gave them law. I gave them peace. But he had given those things on his terms. Now, the realm had answered, and its answer was no more. He wrote to Rome, to Pope Innocent, to the only power above him. The letter was long and bitter. I was forced, he wrote. I signed in duress. They seek to unmake the realm. I ask the Holy Father to annul this charter, and to excommunicate those who forced it upon me. The letter was sealed in black wax, and sent across the sea. The king had not bowed in his heart, not yet, and Rome would soon answer. Peace, they thought, had been signed into the soil at Runnymede, but peace is not a signature, it is a seed, and the king had salted the earth. 2 weeks passed, then 3, and then a parchment arrived from Rome. It bore the golden seal of Pope Innocent III, and inside, written in firm, unmistakable Latin, we declare this charter null, void, without weight, an affront to holy authority. The barons who dared force it shall be excommunicated. The king is restored. This Magna Carta is ashes. The wind turned colder in every chapel that day. The monks who had sung softly in Canterbury fell silent. In York, the charter was taken down from the cathedral door. In Lincoln, the town scribe wept quietly as he placed the scroll back in its box. The dream was undone, not by sword, but by pen from Rome. John smiled. The church is mine again, he whispered. God is with me. They will bow. But the barons did not. They fled court. They gathered again. This time, not with parchment, but with armor. In castles across England, gates were barred, supplies stored, walls reinforced, and for the first time in 100 years, English lords began building not against the French, but against their own king. And John, seated alone in the long stone chamber of Winchester, spoke quietly to the flickering fire. If they would tear my crown from my head, then I will drown them in it. A crown sits easily, when none dare challenge it. But now, the challenge had come, not from invaders, but from within. Summer deepened in the year 1215, but across England, the warmth brought no peace. Instead, banners were raised over keeps that no longer answered to the king. In Lincoln, the sheriff was driven out, his garrison chased beyond the city walls. In Northampton, the gates were closed to royal messengers. The town's bell tower rang at dusk, not for prayer, but for warning. In Bristol, the seal of the king was scraped from the door of the town hall. John's response was not slow, it was sharp. He ordered Castle sieged. He sent letters south, calling up Flemish mercenaries. He summoned what remained of his loyal barons, but few came, and even those who arrived kept their answers brief. "Your Grace, my men are tired. The roads are thick with riders. If I leave my hall, it may not be mine when I return." The realm had begun to fracture, not in a burst, but like frost through stone, silent, slow, unstoppable. He had once ruled a kingdom. Now, he ruled only a path, a stretch of land from castle to port, and not a foot beyond it. Even the coast grew dangerous. Norman pirates had begun raiding English ports. Sensing weakness, John blamed the barons. He blamed the French. He blamed the sky. But he never blamed the one figure at the centre of it all, himself. In the hills beyond Oxford, a force of knights rode under a white banner bearing a black cross. They carried no charter now, only purpose, and their scouts whispered into the wind, "London is ready." A king may rule from a throne, but a realm lives in its cities. And now, the crown had lost its heart. On May 17, 1215, London opened its gates, not to John, but to the barons. The city guard did not resist. No siege, no bloodshed, only doors unlocked, and the streets filled with riders, footmen, and carts bearing supplies, not for war, but for occupation. The people didn't cheer, but they did not cry either. They watched from windows, lowered their heads, and listened, because now, in their churches, priests read not royal edicts, but copies of the charter. John received the news at Winchester. He said nothing for a long while, then whispered, "They've taken London, but they have not yet taken me." But it was clear to all, the capital was gone, and with it, the merchants, the treasury vaults, the seal houses, the scribes, the heart of governance, the soul of England's pulse. Still, the king had not surrendered. In a dim room, beneath a swaying candle, John whispered orders to messengers bound for the coast. "Send word to the Count of Boulogne. Call the mercenaries from Flanders. Have every bow strung, and every oath questioned." He would not lose quietly, and he would not lose alone. Meanwhile, across the channel, a man watched the fog roll in over the sea. His name was Louis, Prince of France, son of Philip, husband to Blanche of Castile, John's niece. He held in his hand a letter, wax seal broken, script in Latin. "The barons of England invite you to claim the throne. Their king has broken all bonds. Come not as conqueror, but as savior. Come now, before the year is out." Rebellion is not born in anger. It is born in disappointment and fed by silence. John no longer rode with banners, only soldiers, men from the coasts, from Flanders, from the old mercenary lanes of Normandy. They spoke different tongues, but they followed silver. He moved fast. From Dover, he struck north, sacked the lands of rebels, burned manors, seized grain, hung peasants who fed the enemy. In Cambridge, a baron's wife was taken hostage. In Hertfordshire, abbeys were torched by royal troops, and in Essex, a priest was nailed to his own door for preaching against the king. The realm recoiled. He had become a king of smoke, a ruler of ashes, one who held not peace, but the match that burned it. Meanwhile, the barons rallied. They held London. They held the charter. They held hope. But hope does not stop steel, and they were not ready for siege. So they did the unthinkable. They sent a final letter across the channel to Prince Louis of France. "Come now, with ships, with knights, with your claim to the crown. You will not invade. You will be received." And in the spring of 1216, ships began appearing along the southern coast. Not English, not hostile, but foreign. The crown had cracked, and now, two kings stood in the wind. One, drowning in his own fire. The other, waiting for the moment to land. On a grey spring morning in the year 1216, England opened her shores to a prince who did not belong, and welcomed him, as if he had always been her own. He landed not with fire, but with parchment, and a promise. Louis, son of Philip Augustus. He came ashore at Sandwich, a quiet port east of London. His boots touched English earth beneath a cloudy sky, and at his side walked knights, not brigands. Barons of France, lords of Poitiers, veterans of campaigns in Flanders. Behind him, ships, 17 at first, then 20 more, each bearing arms, armor, and flags stitched not with lions, but fleurs de lis. The barons met him there, knee-deep in mist and caution. They offered not gold, not silver, but something more dangerous: legitimacy, the charter, the grievances, the papal condemnation, the burnings, the hangings, and at the bottom of the final page, the words they had written with tired, ink-stained hands: "We, the undersigned, nobles of this realm, call upon Prince Louis of France to be king in name, in law, and in God's light, in place of the usurper, John of Anjou." Louis did not smile. He simply said, "Then I shall take what he has already cast aside." It is a strange thing when a foreign prince is called saviour, and the crowned king is no longer called at all. From Sandwich to London, Louis passed through 12 towns, and in each, no arrows flew, no gates closed, only villagers gathering in silence, children watching from behind church doors, priests pausing their sermons to glance toward the hills. He rode beneath banners stitched in haste, bearing the cross of France, and behind him came letters, signed by more than 30 barons, promising fealty to a man who had never worn the crown of England. Yet, in Canterbury, the Archbishop turned his back as the King's name was read at Mass. In Rochester, two royal garrisons abandoned their posts and joined the French escort, claiming they were guarding the future, not the past. In London, the bells rang without order. First 1, then 3, then 9. The streets filled with people, not shouting, but watching, waiting. Louis entered on horseback. His armor glinted dull silver in the pale morning. Behind him, knights, clerks, 2 monks bearing a gilded box, the bones of a French martyr, said to bring victory. No blood was shed, not a drop, only the sound of the city exhaling. The barons met him at the gate to St. Paul's. There was no throne, no coronation oral, only a table, and the parchment. Louis placed his hand upon it. He did not sign, not yet, but he whispered, "Let the people see their king, before the Pope tells them otherwise." A king is not defeated in a day, but in 1,000 small turnings, and this was the turn that broke the circle. In the stone hall at Corfe Castle, John received word, not from a noble, not from a knight, but from a fisherman who had seen the sails. They opened the gates, the man said, barely above breath, and the people, they lit candles in the street. John's face did not change, only his fingers moved, slowly curling into the edge of the table until blood beaded at his nails. He stood, crossed to the window, and stared out over a grey ridge of pine, then said, "I will burn it. If they will not have me as king, then they will have nothing at all." He sent riders to Dover, to Lincoln, to the west. He would not wait. He would scorch the roads. He would tear down the keeps. He would leave Louis with ashes, not a realm. He rode to Cambridge, then Norwich, and Nottingham, not to reclaim, but to punish. Villages that had flown no flag now smouldered. Abbeys that had offered silence were stripped of silver. Civilians who had only prayed for peace were caught between blades sharpened in both names. The people began to flee, not to cities, not to castles, but to woods, to bogs, to old Roman ruins in the wild. The land itself was breaking, the old oath of king and people, unspoken now, and gone, and through the fog of rebellion and foreign tread, truths began to rise. The crown no longer belonged to John alone. The realm may not survive either of them. October, the year 1216, the leaves had browned, the rivers had swelled, and the King of England was running. He did not ride with triumph, nor with plan, only with urgency. From Lynn he fled westward, past marshes swollen by the tides, dragging with him his personal physician, a handful of guards, his treasurer, and 3 wagons of royal gold, relics, and silver plate. They followed a Roman road that had not seen men in a generation. It was waterlogged, rutted, and sinking. "We'll cross the Wash," said one of his men. "It's passable if we time the tides." They did not. At the water's edge, the wagons sank, slowly, into the soft silt. The horses thrashed, the soldiers screamed, the tide came fast, one by one. The chests of treasure, jewels from Anjou, crosses from Canterbury, golden candlesticks gifted by the Pope himself, disappeared beneath grey water. John did not stop. He stared into the flood, said nothing, and turned his horse inland, toward Newark. His gold was gone, his army, scattered, his friends, dead or fled. But he still had a name, and a crown, and in his mind, that was enough. But his body thought otherwise. He came to Newark not in triumph, but in shadow, a king with no crown upon his head, no retinue behind him, no songs to herald his name. It was October 18th. The castle was cold, its halls damp, its chapel unlit, its servants few. The steward, a thin man with quaking hands, bowed as the king entered. "Your grace, your chambers are prepared." They were not. The fire was low, the rushes stale, the bed frame splintered. But the king did not speak. He only fell into the chair beside the hearth, and coughed. By nightfall, the fever had begun. He shivered, slept in fits, cried out once, a name, no one knew which, then went silent again. The physician stood watch beside him, crushing dried herbs into wine. The priest, pale and young, prayed in a corner, but not for a kingdom, only for the man. In his sleep, John whispered, "Don't take it from me. I am still king. They will regret." But the rest was mumbled, lost beneath the hiss of rain, and the distant toll of Newark's evening bell. He asked for bread. He could not swallow it. He asked for figs. They made him wretch. At last, he asked for one thing only, a quiet room, and no mirrors. The servants obeyed. They did not understand, but they obeyed, because even now, he was still their king. Death did not come with thunder. It came on slippered feet, beneath a wool blanket, in a borrowed room, on a borrowed night. John lay still by the hearth. The candle beside him burned low. He had not spoken in hours, only breathed, shallow, rasping. A priest sat at the edge of the room, praying. One servant brought him water. He could not drink. Another warmed a cloth. He did not notice. They did not ask questions, only waited. The king's hand drifted across the bed, searching for something. It closed on the empty space beside him, and clenched. No crown, no air to soothe him, no subjects to weep, only the fire, only the storm beyond the shutters, only silence. Then, a sigh, a slow, rattling exhale, a long pause, and no return. John, King of England, was dead. He was 49. He had ruled 17 years, and left behind an empty throne, a realm in revolt, a boy not yet 10, and a name that no one would speak with love. The priest rose, crossed himself, and whispered, "May God forgive what men will not." Outside, the wind shifted, the rain softened, and the candle beside the bed went out. The crown did not rest long. One head had fallen, another, far smaller, now rose to wear its weight. In the days after John's death, the realm stood still, not in grief, but in confusion. The barons debated, the townspeople waited, the French gathered in quiet council, unsure whether to march or mourn, and in a dim corner of Gloucester Abbey, lit only by candles and thin morning light, the future of England knelt before an altar. His name was Henry. He was 9 years old. He did not understand death, not truly, only that his father was gone, and that strange men now bent to him. A bishop, William Marshall, old and worn, held the crown in trembling hands. It was too large. It slipped when he placed it on the boy's head. They stuffed a linen coif beneath it to hold it still. No music played, no feast followed, only prayer, and the solemn hush of a realm that did not know what came next. Henry said nothing, but when asked to repeat his vows, he did. "I will keep the peace, defend the law, honor the church, and be no tyrant." The bishop anointed him with oil, not in Westminster, but here, in this stone chapel, because London belonged to Louis now. This was not a coronation of victory. It was one of desperation, of survival, of a kingdom trying not to fall apart. They did not gather for John. He had ruled too harshly and died too bitter. But for Henry, they came, In the days after the boy's coronation, a small council assembled inside Gloucester Abbey. Not many, but enough. There was William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, 70 years old, scarred by war, soft of voice, hard of will. Peter de Roches, the boy's tutor, a bishop who trusted Latin more than people. Ranulph of Chester, sceptical, silent, but present. And a handful of lesser lords, who knew that loyalty now might save their lands later. They did not swear fealty to the child. They swore to the idea of the crown, to keep it from falling into foreign hands. "He is too young," said one. So were others. Marshall replied, "But the land does not wait. If we falter now, we will have no land left to give him." They wrote letters, fast and wide, to barons in the north, to abbots in the west, to sheriffs who had not yet pledged to Louis, and each one bore the same message. "The king is dead. Long live the king. His name is Henry. He is young, but he is yours. Do not fight for him. Fight for England." Some sent back oaths, others sent silence, but a few sent swords, and for the first time in weeks, Marshall allowed himself a breath, long, slow, and full of something rare, hope. When he landed, Louis had been greeted like a savior, but England does not love long, not without cost. Word reached him in London, in a tower draped with French banners. A monk brought it, breathless, soaked in mist. "They have crowned him, the boy." In Gloucester, Louis did not answer at first. He held the scroll, read it twice, then set it beside his wine. Soft whisper, "Then I am no longer invited. I must now take it." His knights grew uneasy. Some of his English allies, the barons who had welcomed him months before, now hesitated. They had sworn against John, but this new boy, innocent, quiet, royal, and worse, he was backed by William Marshall, and Marshall was respected in every corner of the realm. Louis knew he had one chance. He could strike quickly, take what remained of the Midlands, and crush Gloucester before the new king's name spread too wide. But the tide was already turning. In Winchester, a French patrol was ambushed. In Dover, the castle refused to open its gates. In the north, nobles began withdrawing their banners. Even the peasants whispered, "A boy wears the crown, but no Frenchman shall keep it." Louis looked at the map. So many names, fewer than before. He poured the rest of his wine into the fire. It hissed, and smoked, and died. Wars are not always born from rage. Sometimes they grow in silence, from duty, from memory, from oaths whispered long ago, and not yet broken. At Gloucester, William Marshall stood alone in the chapel. The boy king slept, and the weight of the realm hung on a man nearly 70. His hair, grey, his back, bowed, but his eyes, still sharp. He had once served 4 kings. He had crossed swords with Saracens beneath the Holy Land sun. He had held oaths to Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and even John. And now, to Henry III, aged 9. Marshall summoned his scribes. Letters were sent to Devizes, Hereford, Shrewsbury, Leicester. He did not call for loyalty. He called for defence. A child wears the crown. If you abandon him, you abandon England. Some answered with steel, others with silence. But enough sent men. The army was small, ragged, but willing. Barons stood beside minor knights. Abbots sent carts of food. Even the townsfolk brought arrows, sacks of "Thank you. Let us now follow the whispers of war as they echo through the hills." The land remembered war. Beneath the grass, Roman bones. Beneath the stone, Saxon scars. And now, once more, men marched upon England. Louis left London with his army. French knights, English rebels, hardened mercenaries. They moved toward Winchester, then turned northwest, aiming to split the realm in two. If they reached Oxford, the kingdom would break. He believed the boy king would stay hidden, that Marshall was too old to ride, that loyalty had thinned beyond mending. He was wrong. At Cirencester, his scouts saw them, a standard bearing the Plantagenet lion, and beside it, Marshall's own banner, a lone white cross on red. Marshall had raised his army, small, worn, but real. Men of Gloucestershire, Somerset, Wiltshire, knights returned from exile, even deserters from John's old forces, fighting not for pay, but for peace. Marshall sent no demands. Only this message: I ride not for revenge, I ride for the boy. Come to battle if you must, but know that when you ride against me, you ride against England's memory. The fields between Lincoln and Stowe became the place. Neither side knew it then, but history was already watching, waiting for the wind to shift. There are battles that roar like storms, and others that pass like ghosts. This one was somewhere between. May 20th, 1217, dawn. The skies over Lincoln were grey. The French held the town, barricaded, braced, armed with confidence. But the people, they watched Marshall's banner rise, and prayed in silence. He did not rush. He waited for the tide to shift, not the sea, but the loyalty of the land. Marshall gave no long speech, only this: we do not charge for conquest. We ride for a child, and for the right to sleep beneath our own sky, without foreign kings in our dreams. Then they moved through the north gate, up the sloping roads, shields high, eyes forward. The French were caught in the open. What followed was swift and silent. Knights on both sides fell. The town square rang with rain and blood. A French commander tried to parley. Too late. Marshall, at 70 years old, was in the fray. His sword did not gleam. It worked. Precise, cold, unapologetic. By midday, the French were fleeing. By sunset, the banners of Henry were raised again over Lincoln's walls. A courier was sent to Gloucester. The boy was told, the crown holds, the land breathes again. You are king, not in title, but in truth. And Louis, he retreated to London, and waited for peace. The swords were still sharp, the wounds still fresh, but even the proudest armies, eventually, want to go home. After the Battle of Lincoln, England did not cheer. She exhaled. The streets remained quiet. The bells rang not for victory, but for the hope of stillness. Louis had lost the field, but he still held London. He still held support from a splinter of barons, and his name still stirred in whispers along the Thames. But he knew he would not wear the crown. So they wrote to the Pope, to France, to Rome and Rouen, letters wrapped in wax, ridden by cold men across long roads. And slowly, the talk shifted from siege to settlement. The meeting place, Lambeth, just across the Thames from London. 3 tents, 1 fire, and 2 worlds held apart by ink and will. William Marshall represented the boy, calm, firm, grave. Louis arrived cloaked, not in armor, but shame. They did not embrace, they did not drink. They spoke, low, measured, and for the first time in months, England listened. A crown can be taken by blade, or returned by pen, but either way, it leaves a scar. The talks began at dawn. No feast, no courtiers, only 2 tired men, and the trembling realm between them. Marshall placed the first scroll down. It bore the seal of Henry, stamped crookily, childlike. Louis glanced at it, said nothing, but the ghost of a smile flickered and died before it could rise. The boy is crowned, Marshall said. The church backs him. The land quiets beneath him. There is no throne for you here, only peace. Louis looked toward the fire, then to the map, then to his hands, and finally replied, I want safe passage for my men, pardons for those who rode with me, and ships enough to return, with dignity. Marshall did not blink. Done. Then came the finer points. No retaliation against the rebel barons. French forces to withdraw within 6 weeks. Louis to renounce all claims to England forever, and in return, a large payment to ease his departure. Silver, not spite. Louis signed. Marshall countersigned. And just like that, the war was over. No trumpet sounded. No flags were raised. No church bells pealed in triumph. Only the wind, and the sound of a prince who came to rule, now preparing to leave in silence. Some men leave with fanfare. Others slip away like tidewater. Louis of France left us both. The sky was overcast above Dover. His men boarded slowly, hands blooded, boots worn thin by foreign soil. There was no salute, no songs, no crowd. A few villagers watched from afar, children too young to know what he had once hoped to be. Louis stood at the rail. He did not wave, he did not bow. He only said, softly, I could have loved this land, if it had loved me back. And then, he was gone. The sails caught, the sea opened, and the prince who almost wore England's crown vanished beyond the mist. Back in Gloucester, the boy king was told with care. He did not smile. He simply asked, "Will they stay with me now?" Marshall knelt before him, old knees, old hands, and whispered, "Some will, others never left. But the crown is yours, Henry, and now, so is the burden." The war had passed like a storm. Now came the stillness and the soft work of rebuilding. In the early winter of 1217, Henry III, just 9 years old, sat in a wooden chair in Gloucester's great hall. It was not yet a throne, but it would become one. Scrolls lay before him. Some he could not read, others he could barely lift. But he tried, with a child's brow furrowed, a child's hands trembling, and a crown that still slipped when he bowed too quickly. William Marshall stood beside him, not as regent, not as king, but as guardian of the boy, of the law, of the fragile peace now stretching across England like frost over grass. Letters were sent again, but now they were gentle, not orders, invitations. The king welcomes your counsel. He offers pardon to those who return. He seeks not to punish, but to begin. Some barons reappeared, sheepishly, humbly, gratefully. Others did not come, but sent gifts. And the church, sensing a clean page, blessed the boy openly. "He is not his father," said a bishop in Ely. "Let us not treat him as such." The crown, battered and bent, had been reforged, not in gold, but in trust. A child may wear the crown, but a kingdom requires hands to hold the reins. And so, Marshall did what wise men do when they can no longer ride into battle. He built a council, not of lords alone, but of minds. There was Hubert de Burgh, sharp of eye, once John's justiciar, now the keeper of law. Bishop Peter de Roches, foreign-born, yet fiercely loyal to Henry's soul. Ranulph of Chester, once hesitant, now anchor between the north and the crown. And Marshall himself, not as sword, but as shield, the boy's silent guardian. They met beneath Gloucester's hall once a week. No throne, no scepter, just words, plans, and parchment, each scroll more precious than any crown. They spoke not of punishment, but of restoration. "We must repair the bridges," said Hubert. "Rebuild the shrines," said the bishop. "Replant the fields," said Ranulph. "And earn the people's silence," whispered Marshall. "For in silence there is peace." They rode 2 towns, listened, asked what was needed, and, wherever they could, they gave it. Stone for broken churches, coins to reopen markets, royal letters to forgive debts caused by war. It was not grand, but it was steady. The barons noticed. The priest spoke kindly again, and the people, weary of chaos, began to call the boy by name. King Henry, not John's son, not the child, but the king. A crown is not earned in gold. It is earned in moments when silence is broken by courage. It began one winter morning. In the cloister of Gloucester Abbey, the council waited. A minor dispute had risen, a land quarrel between 2 barons, each claiming right through ancient writ. Marshall began to speak, but Henry raised his hand. The room fell still, not out of doubt, but out of surprise. The boy, now 10, stood from his wooden chair, walked forward, and spoke. "I have listened long enough. You have taught me to rule, but now, let me learn to decide." His voice was quiet, thin as parchment, but it did not tremble. He asked each baron to speak plainly. He asked the scribe to read the ancient title, and after a pause, he ruled. "Return the land to the church," he said. "Let both men serve the crown instead of feuding. Let peace be the greater inheritance." The room remained quiet. Then, Marshall smiled. A rare thing, a brief thing, but real. Later that evening, he told the bishop, "The boy no longer needs me to speak for him. He only needs me to listen." From that day forward, Henry's voice was invited at every meeting. He rarely spoke, but when he did, he was heard. The dead do not speak, but they are spoken of, and King John was not easily forgotten. Though peace had come, and the boy king sat securely upon the throne, not all in England had found rest. There were debts, oaths broken, tithes unpaid, and lands still trembling from old punishments. "His father once burned this abbey," said a monk to another. He hanged our priest from a tree. He took our grain and taxed the dead, muttered a reeve in Norwich. He starved the north, whispered barons over wine, and sold the south. Henry heard none of these words directly, but he felt them. In every pause before a greeting, in every slow bow, in every uncertain smile, from those who feared another tyrant might bloom from the same root. He asked Marshall once, "Was my father truly so cruel?" Marshall did not answer at first, then said, "He was a king, and kings are judged more by fear than love." Henry looked down at his hands, still small, still unmarked, and whispered, "Then let them judge me by what I heal. A king may inherit a throne, but the pain of a kingdom must be earned." Henry rode not in procession, but in pilgrimage, to see what his father had left behind, to walk the ruined abbeys, the scorched villages, the graveyards with no names on stone. He rode in silence, not with a trumpet, but with parchment, ink, and ears wide open. In Nottingham, a woman approached, veiled, trembling. She held a wooden bowl. Inside, the broken seal of her husband's writ, seized by John's men 10 years past. "He died trying to reclaim our fields," she said. Henry said nothing at first. Then, with hands still too small for a scepter, he signed a new charter. "The land is yours again," he whispered. "No king shall take it without cause. Not again." In York, he walked beneath the cathedral roof, charred black by John's troops during the papal conflict. He knelt there, not as king, but as son of a man many still cursed. He did not excuse John. He did not defend him. He simply said to the archbishop, "I have not come to erase him. I have come to undo what he broke." Priests wept, children stared, and old men in the back row whispered, "This one may be different." He left as a prince under watch. He returned as something else, not fully a king, but something the people had not seen in many years, a ruler who listened. When Henry returned to Westminster, he did not summon his council immediately. Instead, he stood before the scribes, asked for ink, and began to draft, in his own careful hand, a new promise. No church shall be taken without cause, no home seized for debt, no widow taxed beyond her grain, and no peasant's land taken without right. He called it not a law, but a reminder that the crown was not above the people. His council read it in silence. Marshall, older now, slower to rise, whispered, "It is not your father's hand that guides you, it is your own." Henry spoke little that night, but before he retired, he stood before the chapel door and said to those gathered, "He was my father, but I will not be his shadow." In that moment, the people watching didn't see a boy. They saw the first shape of something England had long forgotten. A king who meant to heal, not rule by fear, but by grace. Some serve the crown for silver, some for power, but a few serve only for love. William Marshall was the last of those few. The spring of 1219 came early. The snow melted gently across the fields of Caversham, where Marshall now rested. He had not mounted a horse in weeks. His hands, once iron, trembled like old parchment, but his mind remained sharp. From his bedchamber, he could still see the river, still hear the clang of training swords, still smell the wax and vellum of a crown just learning to settle. And he knew it was time. Henry came to him one final time, now 11, with shoulders slightly broader, with questions fewer in number, but deeper in weight. He sat beside the old knight, said nothing for a while, then asked, "What should I do when you are gone?" Marshall smiled faintly. "Do as you've begun. Speak less than you listen. Write more than you command. Forgive, even when you are not asked. And never forget the faces of those who suffer quietly." Henry tried not to weep. Marshall noticed, and nodded. Good, a king must feel, but he must also hold. That night, Marshall summoned the bishops, the nobles, and his eldest sons. He gave away nothing of gold, only land, to those he had fought beside, and one scroll, to Henry, sealed in wax. "This realm I have protected. Now, you must keep it. Some deaths shake kingdoms, others settle them." Marshall's death was the second kind. He passed just before dawn. No cry, no struggle, no great sign in the sky, only the flicker of the candle at his bedside, and the sudden stillness in the room. The bishop whispered last rites. The steward knelt with tears in his beard. Henry held the man's hand as it called. There was no throne in the chamber, no crown, just a chair, and a folded blanket, and a boy who realized something deep and permanent had ended. Henry did not speak for a full day. He ate in silence, prayed without prompting, walked the gardens alone, past the horses, the river, and the barracks Marshall had once built. When he returned to the council room that evening, he stood at the head of the table. The men looked to the door behind him, as if expecting Marshall to enter last, as he always had. But only Henry stood. He took his seat, straight-backed, eyes forward, still as the stone behind the throne, and said only this: "He's gone. Now I will listen and decide. In his name, yes, but in mine, too." Outside, in the abbey, the people gathered for the burial, nobles and farmers alike, not to mourn a king, but to bury something rarer, the last true knight. Some men leave behind towers, some leave behind songs, and some leave behind peace. Marshall's funeral was held in the Temple Church, in London, not Westminster, not Windsor, but a simple round chapel built for the Knights Templar, where he had once knelt as a young man and sworn to defend the innocent. He was buried at the entrance, so that every pilgrim who entered would walk over the grave of a man who guarded England until the end. There was no crown on the casket, only a white cloth, a single sword, and a stone with his name and nothing more. Henry stood with the bishops and barons, still cloaked in black, still small beside the tomb. But when the priest finished the final rites, Henry stepped forward and spoke. He was not my blood, but he was my shield. He did not raise me with kisses or songs, but with truth, and because of him, I am not afraid. He knelt beside the grave, and placed a small wooden carving at its foot, a lion, hand-carved, then whispered, barely heard, "Thank you, William. I will not waste what you gave me." The crowd parted, the bells rang once more, and as they faded, the land itself seemed to fall quiet again. Thus ended the guardianship of William Marshall, and thus began, truly, the reign of Henry III. A king's test does not always come with steel. Sometimes it comes with silence and empty bowls. The year after Marshall's death, the skies stayed grey, the rains lingered, the wheat turned pale, the rivers rose just enough to spoil the lowest fields, and by midwinter, the grain markets were bare. In Bury St. Edmunds, the price of bread doubled. In Norwich, a man was hanged for stealing a sack of barley. In York, a mother left her children at the doors of the abbey, too ashamed to beg, too proud to steal. Whispers reached Westminster. The king is too young. He cannot stop the hunger. Where is Marshall now? But Henry did not panic. Instead, he did what Marshall had taught him. He listened. He summoned his council, and, for the first time, overruled them. "Do not hoard the grain," he said. "Release the royal stores, lower the tariffs on northern grain, and open the abbey granaries, with or without the bishop's consent." Some nobles protested, but the people cheered quietly. In markets and along river banks, they cheered a king who remembered them. In the weeks that followed, barges from Bristol to Canterbury brought relief. It was not plenty, but it was enough, and the people began to say, "He is not like his father. He may yet become a true king." Some kings ruled from towers, others from the ground. He did not tell the court. He took only 4 guards, wore a plain cloak, and walked the road to Canterbury in early spring, where the famine still pressed. The people saw him, but did not kneel. Not at first. They stared, wary, worn, unbelieving, until a child stepped forward with a crust of bread and offered it to him. Henry knelt, took it, broke it in half, and gave it back. In that moment he said nothing, but everything changed. He visited abbeys with empty stores, ordered new grain wagons from London, sat in silence with mothers whose children had died. He touched no scepter, signed no decree, only listened. At a chapel near St. Albans, a monk recited psalms as Henry ladled soup into cracked bowls, not for ceremony, but because he meant to. "This is not royal," said a noble who followed him. Henry turned. "Then it is exactly what a king should be." The next morning, he ordered a new ledger created, a record of all royal grain stores, updated weekly, publicly displayed, never taxed during famine. It was simple. It was humble, it saved thousands, and it changed the way the people spoke his name. The land remembered, not the hunger, but the one who came walking. When others stayed behind palace gates, spring returned. This time, fully, the barley grew again, the wheat turned gold, children ran barefoot through market squares once quiet, and the king, he walked among them still, not just once, not just for show, but every Lent thereafter. He left court, donned a plain cloak, walked with his scribes and servants, no fanfare, no soldiers, to listen, to learn, to be seen, and to see. He would ask bakers how the price of flour had changed, sit with monks over lentils, kneel beside a widow planting her spring onions, and ask, "What do you need?" He did not always give silver, but he always left heard, and soon, the people began to prepare for his steps. They swept their paths, hung garlands, set out bowls of warm cider, not for spectacle, but because he came back, every year, and in time, the people said, his father ruled with fear, but this one, he rules with his feet in our dust, and his ears in our kitchens. It was in these journeys, in these quiet Lenten steps, that Henry's reign became something real, something rooted, not in banners, not in battles, but in being present. Not all kings are remembered, and not all kings are mourned, but some, end their reign not in failure, but in quietness. Henry ruled for over 50 years, the longest reign of any English king before his time. He saw the end of one century, and the uncertain trembling of another. He built churches, held feasts, watched his sons rise and fall. He endured rebellion, made peace with France, and wrote more letters than swords ever drawn. Yet, the shadow of John never fully left. Some still whispered, "Is he truly different?" Others said, "He's too soft," and still others, when fields failed or taxes rose, muttered, "A lion's son may yet bite." Henry heard these things. He did not argue. He simply walked slower in his gardens, held his parchments longer before sealing them, and prayed longer at Vespers than most remembered. He ordered a new shrine for Edward the Confessor in Westminster, not for politics, but for sanctuary, a place where memory might live, without fear. But still, he felt it, the chill of being misremembered, or worse, forgotten. What will they say of me? He asked his chaplain one evening. That I tried, that I was not John. There was no answer that night, only the soft breath of wind through the halls of Westminster, where both kings, cruel and kind, had walked. To rule long is not to rule well, for memory grows thin, and peace, left unattended, feeds its own fire. It began with murmurs in the halls of Oxford, where barons met without invitation, in London's markets, where taxes were cursed in low voices, and in the council chambers, where once loyal men began to question. The king has ruled too long, his son is proud, his court is ruled by foreigners, not by England. It was not one man who rebelled, it was many, led not by a sword, but by Simon de Montfort, once Henry's friend, and now his fiercest opponent. A letter came. "The Rome is weary, my lord. The people do not hate you, but they do not follow you either." Henry sat in silence. He did not call his army. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed the letter in the fire and watched it burn. But that night, he walked alone through Westminster, past the chapel where he once prayed beside William Marshall, past the kitchens that now whispered into languages, past the throne that had grown too wide for his aging frame. "They no longer see me," he said softly, "only my weight and my shadow." In the months to follow, protests grew. The provisions of Oxford were signed, laws that took power from Henry's hand and gave it to a council he did not lead, but obeyed. He had once ruled by mercy, but now mercy made him look weak. He had once ruled with care, but now care could not stop ambition. The boy who walked among the poor had become a king walked around by his peers. Some kings fall to steel, some to betrayal, but some fade softly, like ink left too long in the sun. Henry ruled until the age of 65. He outlived his enemies, his allies, even the rebellion that once unseated him. Simon de Montfort, his old friend turned rival, had been killed in battle. His son, Edward, had risen to power, a sharper blade, a louder name, and Henry, He sat quietly at Westminster, listening more than he spoke. He no longer walked the Lenten roads. His knees ached, his hands trembled, and the people, once warmed by his presence, now looked toward Edward, the prince, the lion, the future. Henry spent his final days in the cloisters, feeding birds, writing psalms, and visiting the shrine he had built for Edward the Confessor, the only king he ever tried to imitate. No fanfare, no decree, just a crown worn too long, and a man who once ruled with his feet in the dust, now sitting, quietly, waiting. Was I enough? He asked his chaplain one evening. Not great, not feared, but kind. Will that be remembered? Henry III died in 1272. No riots broke out, no towers fell, no poets wept. He was buried beside the shrine he had built, the only one he ever bowed to. His tomb bore his name, but no legend, no title, just a line: Henry, by the grace of God, King. And that was all. Some kings are cursed, some crowned in glory. But Henry, he was neither. He was simply the king no one mourned.